Ego is one's true desire to achieve their personal goal. It's the driving force of every player, and it's heavily connected with their hopes and their dreams.
At the beginning of Blue Lock, it seemed like Ego was associated with only strikers. Blue Lock was created with the sole intent of Japan winning the World Cup.
In order to accomplish this goal, Japan would first need an egoist, a player who can be the revolutionary striker for Japan and bring their country to the pinnacle of world football.
To prove this way of thinking, Jinpachi Ego used examples of successful revolutionary strikers, players like Noel Noa, Cantana, and the legendary Pele. These players were living proof of this egoist ideology.
All of these players became the best in the world because of their massive egos. This made it apparent that Japanese football would never reach the top of the world unless they had their own egoist.
Eventually, this ideology became the foundation for all the players who entered Blue Lock. As they entered the facility, it seemed like this was going to be a simple and straightforward concept, but we were sadly mistaken.
Throughout the story of Blue Lock, the concept of ego and the world of Blue Lock became something much grander than we originally expected. In this video, we wanted to talk about how Blue Lock and the concept of ego evolved through its development.
Blue Lock was originally designed to create the egoist striker for Japan, but that experiment changed once Blue Lock vs Japan U20 match came into fray.
After Blue Lock won against the Japan U20 team, Jinpachi Ego was given complete control over the Japan U20 team, thus creating the Neo-Egoist League. These players are now given the opportunity to show their egos in different positions in order to earn spots for Jinpachi Ego's Japan U20 team.
Now players don't need to aim to be that one revolutionary striker. Players can now survive by playing in other positions, and now we're seeing egoists in every different way and form. This change has altered our whole understanding of the concept of ego.
From what we are able to understand, every player has their own version of ego, and each one of these players channels it so they can become a protagonist of their own story. This concept of protagonism would become relevant in the NEL.
Once a player notices their ego and sense of protagonism, they immerse themselves in creating their ideal plays, aka flow state. And being an egoist isn't limited to only just scoring goals like a striker. We've seen through the NEL and in the Japan U20 match that players can act as playmakers and assisting their teammates, being a defender, winning duels, or even stopping goal-scoring attempts as a goalkeeper. Remember, the ego is the driving force of all these players' inspirations and dreams. Once they've realized this hunger and desire pushes the players into achieving their goals where they can feel like the protagonist of their own story. And this can have a different trigger for different players, but ultimately this sense of protagonism is the key for reaching flow state and creating a super play.
We are only able to understand this because of egocentrism, which is the ability to understand oneself and other people's perspectives. In that match against Manshine City, Isagi was able to read and understand those motivations or protagonism behind people's playstyles through his metavision and egocentrism.
While trying to be the protagonist of their own story, some players use different means to achieve this. Like we said, some will try to assist, some will try to score. Either way, this desire and hunger forces these players to challenge themselves and deliver their best performances, which is also the philosophy behind chemical reactions.
That's right. After discovering egocentrism, Isagi confirms that chemical reactions can only occur if two protagonists intersect and they cross paths to achieve their own goal. This is why ego is so essential to all players. Their ego is the true driving force that pushes them to become a protagonist, which activates their flow state and creates chemical reacts with other players.
To break it down for you guys, protagonism leads to flow, and when another character reaches protagonism and then reaches their flow, the flow and flow combination creates the chemical reaction, and then creating a super play like we've seen throughout Blue Lock. The next big egoist discovery was during the Bastion Munchen and PXG match. This was when Isagi witnessed Charles and Shido's chemical reaction. Isagi was mesmerized by this play, and he was focused on breaking it down and learning the mechanics behind this super play.
That's where we see Isagi and Hiyori explain the process of achieving one's peak performance. So as long as a player possesses an ego or hunger, the belief of being a protagonist, and the drive to achieve a reachable goal, then they can enter flow state. After achieving a flow state, if this player links up with another player who's also trying to be a protagonist of his own story, then these two would be able to create a chemical reaction and even potentially create their own peak performance. And that whole ideology can also explain Isagi and Hiyori's amazing chemical reaction that resulted in that winning goal versus Uber.
Let's take a second and look at this, because this is the true mechanics behind every player's peak performance. Ego has been laying down this foundation ever since the beginning of Blue Lock, making the players realize their hunger, their sense of originality, their sense of protagonism. He's been trying to bring this out of these players ever since the beginning, but after analyzing how to achieve a peak performance through chemical reactions, we see Isagi discover another factor: the two ego categories, the world type and self-type egos.
To start off, we're going to talk about self-type. The self-type egoists are players who seek the pleasure of fulfilling their stories in the way they want, while the world-type egoists are players who achieve these peak performances through aspiring to win high accomplishments like trophies.
Self-types are usually associated with strikers, think of players like Shido, Baro, and Nagi. All of these players want to display performances that value themselves and show that they are the best regardless of other people's perspective, while the world types are usually associated with midfielders, defenders. Some good examples would be Reo, Hiri, and Karasu. These players focus on delivering a performance that will give them pleasure from what the world thinks of their actions, ultimately helping them push their teams and even win accolades like trophies. It's important to note that it doesn't matter if you're a world type or a self-type egoist. One isn't greater than the other, they just express themselves in different manners. It's important to note that they aren't limited to a box while they're in these ego types. They can still perform different plays and perform different performances, and the next big discovery was actually another part of the ego type, which was the ego environment.
There are two different types of ego environments, freedom and restrictive. These next two examples will both be self-type egoists, but you will see how different these two players actually are. These players situated in the freedom environment tend to be free thinkers. These players find it easier to display their abilities by coming up with multiple scenarios and then choosing the best one out of those options.
One of the best examples of a freedom-based player would be Shido. He thrives in situations where he can totally be free in his mind and create his ideal plays. And don't forget, Lotus said this is a self-type egoist, so Shido is self and freedom, meaning he derives from performing plays that show that he is the best, but also showing that he is free, hence why he's self-freedom. Other players who are associated with restrictive environment, they're completely different. These players excel while they're given a fixed role or faithfully following a task until it's accomplished. A good example of this would be Kunigami, because at the beginning of the PXG match, Kunigami was struggling to make an impact, but once Noah instructed Kunigami with the task of restricting Shido's freedom, he instantly started to perform well.
Both of these players are self-type egoists, but they deliver their peak performance through different means. Their ego type would be determining factors for players to overcome their ultimate challenge and create their peak performance. And utilizing all this new information, we can categorize every player's ego type and environment.
And remember, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that even though you're a self-type egoist, it doesn't mean you're a bigger egoist than a world-type egoist, and vice versa. Their desires are different, but it doesn't mean that their hunger is any different from each other.
The concept of ego has evolved and expanded into something much greater than we originally expected. It's not as simple as we first believed at the beginning of the story. And to bring this full circle, during Jinpachi Ego's speech to the 300 Blue Lock participants, he was mentioning the ego required for this final hero. This hero would need an ego so big that it would bring Japan to the top of the world, which makes us believe that the final egoist would be a world-type egoist.
The reason why we believe this is because world-type egoists are obsessed with the world's point of view of them, as well as acquiring trophies. We could be wrong about this. Maybe there's a chance a self-type egoist could be the piece that Japan needs. Or what if there's a player who is both, a player who cannot be limited to just one type of ego, the ultimate egoist. This player could be obsessed with himself and how the world views him.
A player that transcends our own comprehension and delivers the critical moment that Japan needs. But before we end off, we wanted to guess what ego types we would fall into. Personally, I would fall under self-restrict. Having a clear goal in front of me allows me to put all of my focus and effort into achieving that one thing. Whereas in my opinion, having too many possibilities would probably overwhelm me as there is no clear direction at that moment.
If I'm picking for myself, I think I would actually be a world-type restriction egoist, because very similar to you, Lotus, I'm very obsessed with achieving a specific goal. I feel like once I have a clear goal and I have a list of tasks to achieve, I actually go out and perform my best performances. For that reason, I feel like I fall into the restriction ego environment, and I feel like I'm also a world-type egoist because I'm obsessed with how the world views me. So I would say I'm a world restrictive type egoist. That being said, you guys now have all this information on how the concept of ego has evolved, and you can even fit yourself into some of these ego types. As a fun little activity, can you guys let us know what ego type are you and what ego type environment would you fall under? Please let us know in the comments, what type of egoist are you?
Yep, and as always, thank you for stopping by. If you haven't already, please consider giving the video a like, comment, or consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, we do have a link to our community Discord that is in the description of this video below.
Yes, thank you for stopping by. Thank you for sticking to the end. We appreciate you guys. This is Tev.
And it's Lotus.
Peace. Have a good one.